Hello, and welcome back to Watching Brief this week. Not even for the month of. It is, in fact, a whole new era here at Watching Brief, and I'm joined by the wonderful co-host Andy Brockman. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Mark, and I hope our viewer is suitably impressed by the amount of money we've spent on the new set for the new format.
Exactly. Everything is different. I mean, it's all behind the camera, obviously, but I've got a jacuzzi over there. There's a nice little chaise longue in the corner with a margarita bar. It's good. It's very good.
I've got a reconstructed red wall behind me.
Brilliant. I'm impressed.
Yeah. Well, apparently it was demolished last year, so I thought I'd have it back here and rebuild it.
I see. Impressive. Deep cut there on the slightly political meme. But no. In all seriousness, this new format Watching Brief, which is our continuing mission to examine the archaeological news of the day and present an editorialized version for you here to discuss below, is shifting to a weekly format. This will help us to be more fleet of foot, to be able to respond to the news of the day much more topically as it's happening, as opposed to waiting for 3 weeks perhaps to talk about it. And also, as well, as you'll see at the end of this week's segment, we are opening up elements of the show to other people, maybe guest segments, guest speakers, opinion pieces, and we certainly have someone who has an opinion on this week's Watching Brief at the end.
Most definitely has.
Most definitely. But this week's Watching Brief, we've actually had to throw out the whole format, because actually the new format is going to be broken down into 2 or 3 different segments per week, talking about 2 or 3 different stories. And one of those stories this week was going to be Oliver Dowden, the Minister for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and his seemingly weekly briefings to the Telegraph, or certainly regular briefings to the Telegraph, and his this week his desire to combat Maoist tendencies amongst historians and archaeologists.
Now I have a problem with that, because when I first read that article, I read that as meowist. I don't know why, but I thought, wait a minute, why is he suddenly? Yeah, exactly. Why is he suddenly comparing? Archaeologists and historians who want to decolonise the curriculum in our museums with cats and so on. But no, apparently no. He meant Maoist. And then, okay, right, Maoist. It's a trigger word. It implies the little red books and the hard left and so on. Yeah. So, yeah, okay. Yeah. Basically, he's reverted to type.
Exactly. So. Yeah, he has. But of course, despite being paid up communists, we've. No, obviously we're not. No, but despite
my notebook here by the desk is red.
Oh, I see. You have a red notebook. Well, that's a red flag.
Well, absolutely.
Red flag. No. In all seriousness, despite wanting to comment on this and examine the attempt to stoke culture wars, and actually, to be honest, also comment on the fact that lots of archaeologists are saying ignore it, it'll go away. This week, we have to talk about something which has really been breaking the past couple of days, and ironically enough, highlights the fact that if you ignore it, it won't go away. We're talking, of course, about the threat to the existence of the archaeology department at Sheffield University. And this comes in the context of, as we've talked about in previous Watching Briefs recently, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, actively cutting funding for higher education archaeological courses. It comes in the context of this notion of the culture war and archaeologists somehow being more dangerous than historians or sociologists or psychologists or anyone else. And it also comes in the context of Hull University certainly winding up elements of its archaeological operations, Chester University having a severe cut likely to staff numbers, if not elements of their teaching offerings. And as some people have been saying overnight, if the Sheffield department falls, this could be a domino, the first domino in a fairly major string of dominoes. Essentially, archaeology is facing an existential crisis in the UK at the moment. But don't just believe me on that. Andy, can you take us through what's been happening, where it began, and I suppose where we are now?
Right. Well, anybody who's been observing the archaeology world for any length of time knows that crises come and go. They're like buses. They come along fairly regularly, and sometimes more than one comes along at once. What's happened this time is a combination of economic issues that have really been building up since at least 2010, if not longer, coming on top of the so-called war on woke, a very activist government that seized higher education, for example, in very strategic and utilitarian terms. And then, of course, in the last year, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has thrown everybody's economic calculations up in the air again, and particularly in the universities where university staff and any of us who know or work with or talk to people working in higher education and education in general know quite how stressful and difficult the last year has been for people to try and keep courses going in the pandemic conditions. So,
well, on that note, can I just insert a link below to both the news article and also a screen grab from that article, where Gavin Williamson put out a statement that said the government has said subjects like music, dance, drama and performing arts, art and design, media studies and archaeology are not among its strategic priorities. So that's I suppose a little touchstone for what you've just been saying there.
That's absolutely right. And that's something that people, particularly on the political right, have been talking about for many, many years. They've wanted to thin out what they see as worthless degrees or airy-fairy degrees or whatever, and particularly things like the performing arts and so on. And I think that's an important point to stress. Archaeology isn't in this on its own. And the arts community, in fact, has been running for some time now a very active campaign to protect the arts in education, and very generously has actually included archaeology in their campaigning. Specifically, they've been mentioning archaeology as being under threat too.
Yes, yeah. That's also linked below. So go ahead.
Indeed. Getting back to the Sheffield situation, specifically what appears to have happened at Sheffield is that the course has been under financial stress for some time within the university. In the last few years, the head of department asked for additional staff to be able to sort of effectively reboot the department, reboot the teaching, re-energise, and solve these issues. The university approved 3 new posts and appeared to be going forward on that basis. But then COVID happened. The department was put under review, and those posts and the funding for them were withdrawn. What has brought it to a head is that after months of review, which appears to have gone on under the radar, it's not been general knowledge within the archaeological world, and certainly not in the archaeological media. And I regret we weren't able to highlight this earlier. But yesterday there was a meeting at the university. That's yesterday at the time of recording, which was the 19th of May. Where effectively staff were told that there were 3 options that the university had decided upon, which were going to be voted on by the university's executive board, which meets on the 25th of May, next Tuesday. Option A, which is to support and invest in the department to ensure the future of archaeology at Sheffield, which is basically what the department wanted. It wanted to have additional investment to re-energise the department and take it forward. Option B is to discontinue archaeology as a subject at Sheffield and make all the staff redundant. And option C, which is a sort of halfway house to option B, which is to discontinue archaeology as a department but retain certain aspects of archaeological research and education, for example, human osteology and cultural heritage, within the university but within other departments. A post on a forum from somebody who was at the meeting reported it was strongly perceived that the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, who's the second senior manager of the university, had a preference which was not for option A, but didn't say specifically whether it was option B or option C, which they preferred. Option C really is death by 1,000 cuts, and eventually it basically, put it this way, I've been reaching out to contacts this morning, and one perception is that if there's a big pushback on this, and we'll talk about the petition in a minute, which is already attracting It was launched today, and it's already approaching 5,000 signatories. But if there's a lot of pushback on this, and it makes the university look really bad, then they can say, "Oh well, we're not going to get rid of the department completely. We're going to save the department, or save the department's principal lines of work and research by subsuming them into other departments. There won't be quite as many redundancies." And of course, once it loses its identity, it can be quietly left to wither on the vine.
Yeah.
So that's the situation that the staff and students there are facing at the moment as we speak.
Now, arguably, there's another more specific element in option C there, and that seems to be an element which is actually one which this is seemingly in line with the current government's attitude to, specifically, it seems, archaeology when it comes to studying the past, and that is that they want the practical doings of archaeology with any of the uncomfortable happenings that follow. So synthesizing data, thinking a lot about the context of that data, and also providing that information for public discourse when it comes to thinking about our shared heritage. I'm reminded of the fact that this in the past couple of days there's been a couple of prominent news stories featuring archaeologists, and one of them, for example, is with regards to the Cern Abbas giant, where archaeologists did some analysis of snail shells to establish the age of the geoglyph. And is it a geoglyph? The chalk image on a hillside.
I think it's a geoglyph, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And they weren't called archaeologists; they were called scientists. In that context, they were useful scientists, providing a little bit of trivia about the Cern Abbas giant. Another news story that's actually very much at the top of the agenda this week is with regards to the crimes of Fred West. And an investigation that's underway at the moment in Gloucester underneath a cafe, where the headline here from the Shields Gazette is "Forensic Archaeologists Begin Work at Gloucester Cafe in Search for South Shields Teenager Feared Killed by Fred West," a fairly infamous serial killer here in the UK. In these two instances, these are practical services that archaeologists can provide, and therefore they're either framed as scientists or indeed they are actually given their full title of forensic archaeologist. In other instances, archaeologists are described as being baffled, or as being boffins, or as being essentially hobbyists who are fortunate to be able to do this as their job. And I find this very interesting. This is an ongoing query I have, in so much as I've never got into a taxi without the taxi driver going, "Oh, I wish I'd been an archaeologist, yeah." And yet, despite that, it seems that the actual function of archaeology and the way archaeologists work hasn't actually filtered through to the public. The fact that these sorts of movements are possible without too much public outrage, I think says a lot about the profile of archaeology in this country. Just one more thing as well. An anonymous colleague this morning he's actually been quoted in a couple of different places this morning on Twitter, so I don't think that they'll mind if I say this. Was quoted as saying, "If you think that the biggest threat to history at the moment is the removing of a couple of statues, although actually it's one statue that's been removed illegally in this country, rather than the loss of multiple departments of archaeology from the UK universities, you are massively misguided. This is absolutely heartbreaking." How big a loss could Sheffield represent if it is in fact shut down? Because I've seen it described as one of the best archaeology departments in the world this week. Do you think that's true?
Look, I think we need to put this in context. Sheffield is a Russell Group university. That's the very top tier of British higher education. So if it is going to withdraw from teaching archaeology, that is a very significant statement in its own right. It's an implicit statement of no confidence. And the other thing about it is that academically, yes, Sheffield is highly respected. Sheffield graduates are across the profession and all over the world. And it has particular strengths in archaeological science, in osteoarchaeology and zooarchaeology. The scientific, it's in a sense, it's not the airy-fairy, theoretically based deconstructionist, postmodernist, whatever. that end of academic archaeology. It's absolutely at the hard science end of archaeology. And again, if that, they have a zoo archaeology lab that only opened, I think, in 2017, a new facility. So and that was obviously a statement of intent of the importance to actually invest that money, of the university to invest that money at that point. So this is really, really significant. I think the other thing as well is that it is actually incoherent, because when the story broke, I went to the Sheffield website to see how it was promoting itself to its students, or would-be students, and PhD candidates, and so on, as a centre to come to. And this is a direct quote from the prospectus for undergraduates on the archaeology BSc. Quote: "The archaeology workforce in the UK needs to grow by 25% over the next 5 years and by 64% by 2033 to meet the demands of infrastructure projects. Sheffield graduates are highly skilled and equipped to join this growing industry." This is a strategic balls up of monumental proportions if this happens, because unless I wouldn't put it past this government, they completely throw out the National Planning Policy Framework and that kind of nuclear option to remove archaeology from the planning system. Although there might be some people on the right of politics who'd like to see that happen, more or less, it's very unlikely that would ever happen. But in which case, a stream of new archaeologists, and particularly with skills like forensics, like the technical skills that are needed on sites, and particularly big construction projects. And we've got not just the Stonehenge tunnel and dual carriageway, but many other infrastructure projects, including a potential another runway at Heathrow and others all over the country. It could lead to a crunch in the manning, the crewing, rather, I should say, of archaeological sites that are done as part of the planning system. And that means if you haven't got your workforce locally, you have to bring them in from outside, and that goes against all the principles of controlling borders and controlling immigration. And actually, it becomes difficult because wages in archaeology, as we've discussed before, don't meet Home Office criteria for visas.
Exactly, because we're not skilled workers, apparently, despite needing degrees to get. and
we go round and round on this, and we have done before, and we will continue to do so. I'm sure.
I think, I suppose, just as we draw this to a close for this segment, and hopefully this new weekly format, this has been a good test case, a good pilot for this format. I suppose I would close on a simple suggestion. It's one that I've made before, but that is that archaeology needs to find a way to break its relationship with civil engineering projects. Because even if it is true that, and I've seen it said, for example, on the Archaeosoup Facebook page in recent days, it's one of the best times ever to be an archaeologist. I think you can say that if you look at the notion that, yes, there's lots of archaeological jobs out there, potentially. But these jobs rely on the whims of government, on the willingness of government to provide money for these large projects. And when that money's gone, the jobs disappear. Recently, we've seen a wonderful move from, I think it was Wessex Archaeology, to put all their archaeologists on permanent contracts. I think that's a step in the right direction. And as this is the bit that I've said previously, is that I think archaeology could learn from some of the things that happen in, for example, Hollywood. Weta Workshop in New Zealand, for example, between big jobs, they definitely have peaks where they're hiring hundreds of people to do, for example, the computer graphics work on a film like Lord of the Rings. But when it's a downtime, most of those people are retained by giving them opportunities to retrain, to learn new skills, to move around, to work on their own projects, and so fewer people have this uncertainty in terms of their career path. I don't think it's any longer sustainable, and particularly in an environment where it seems the government is actively hostile towards your career, to have our leaders and our primary employers in this field still saying things like, Yay! The government's building a motorway. Yippee! We've got a new housing development over the hill. I think we need to do better. And whatever happens with Sheffield, archaeology needs to fundamentally revisit its structure, and that may have to start from the top down, because it doesn't look as though necessarily we've had the loudest voices so far at the top responding to Sheffield.
Well, that's a point I'd like to make. Now, again, I'm trying to find out. I don't know at the moment what the situation was with Sheffield, whether people were told they weren't allowed to talk about it in outside of the university. I would argue that actually in the public interest, there are ways of contacting people like us so that we can break these stories. Because I think it's in the public interest that they're discussed openly, because what appears to have happened here is that university senior management have played a very canny game in that they had the meeting yesterday on the 19th. The story broke yesterday afternoon into the early evening, which meant that there were 3 working days with a weekend in the middle before the meeting that's going to take the decision supposedly on Tuesday.
Yes.
They basically have controlled the narrative and controlled the timing to make it very, very difficult for anybody to respond in any meaningful and coherent way. And to be honest, if the archaeological bodies who are responding today and issuing statements, and CIFA, just as we were going to record this, CIFA issued a statement supporting the people at Sheffield and at Chester and Leicester, another university where this kind of thing is happening. But if they only found out about what was going on yesterday, if they didn't have an inkling before about what was going on, then they've been asleep at the wheel.
Yeah.
And I would urge people, this is too big for one individual, for one university or whatever. This is a major story for our sector. It's in the public interest. It's in our sector's interest. In the end, it's in the interest of every archaeologist that what's going on is opened up to public scrutiny, and that these very admittedly difficult decisions and controversial decisions are properly examined and not railroaded through, as appears to be happening at Sheffield, as the accusation stands at the moment.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I could keep on adding to that, but we are trying to be disciplined in this new format, so we'll bring it to a close there. We will invite you, though, to share any comments or insights you might have, either via DMs on Twitter or, for example, in the email address that you can see below. We're also linking below to the change.org petition, which just topped 4,900, I think, signatures, and it's well on its way to 5,000. And I suppose we will now close out with the new portion, the newest element of this new watching brief, and that is a contribution from a guest opinion provider, that namely Tristan Boyle of the Archaeology Podcast Network, and he's talking today about museums, the British Museum, and the Benin bronzes. Enjoy.
Hi, my name is Tristan, and I'm a digital public archaeologist. I'm really interested in how society deals with the past, and in particular, the relationship that we have with museums and the items in those museums. Looking back at the past can be challenging. It's no wonder that we all slip into one form of nostalgia or another at some point in our lives, where we try and remember the good old days.
You remember the good old days? You could get fish and chips and polio in the good old days.
This protective behaviour, however, can be to our own detriment, and especially when we forget the negative things that have happened to us, and more importantly, when we have engaged in negative behaviours. So if that's true for the individual, what happens when a country, a society, experiences nostalgia? Oh, but you can't place the sins of the fathers on the children. But if that were true, neither could you take the so-called glory of the father and place it also on the children. If you wish to be attached to heritage in such a way as to be proud of it, you must also reckon with its darker side as well. And let's not simplify things. This is difficult, this is hurtful, and it's challenging. especially if for your whole life you've only heard one part of the narrative. When I was a student at the University of Aberdeen, I talked with Neil Curtis, who was the head of collections at the Uni Museums, about the repatriation of Maori heads back to communities in New Zealand. That demonstrated to me the possibilities and the hurdles that the process of repatriation brings. This is why a superficial reading of the debates about whether museums should repatriate or not shouldn't be the main focus of our society. Instead, we need to think about the role that museums play in the creation of history. A topical example would be the Benin bronzes, which have been in the headlines recently, in part due to books like Dan Hicks's The Brutish Museums or Barnaby Phillips's Loot. But it'd be wrong to look at this as some sort of fad or recent endeavour, as the requests for the repatriation of Benin bronzes have been going on for years. The University of Aberdeen, in fact, has recently decided to work with Nigeria to return their Benin bronzes in their collection back to Nigeria. But it's not so simple for other institutions. The British Museum is blocked in many ways by law from being able to repatriate its items. Perhaps there, a change in the law is necessary. But other museums simply don't return items because they don't feel there are good enough reasons. And I just don't think that can be the way forward. If repatriation and reparations are to develop properly, there needs to be independent arbitration, and a museum cannot hold all the power. The default can no longer be that items have to stay in a museum, but we also cannot override the communities to whom these items may hold relevance and their wishes. That's why we have to make the change to power dynamics between these communities and museums, and to make these decisions transparent and transformative. I think there's always going to be a need to understand and handle history, no matter how scary that may be. And Britain has a very mixed history. It's not simple and straightforward, and that's why we need to discuss and dive into the nuances in that history without discarding the harmful aspects as some inevitable part of history. And perhaps from that, we can find ways of moving forward. But I'd like to know what you think. Should museums be the final arbitrators of their own collections? Does repatriation actually make a difference? I run the Archaeology Podcast Network, and I do a show on that called Modern Myth. These are the kind of conversations that I would like to give a platform to. You can find me spending too much time on Twitter at @anarchaeologist. And finally, my ultimate question really is, does it belong in a museum?